buenas tardes. Es un gusto poder saludarlos y poder recibirlos al seminario de este mes, a nuestro seminario de investigación. El día de hoy estamos muy felices de poder tener con nosotros a la doctora Moria Faul. Moira, bienvenida. El seminario se va a llevar a cabo en inglés. Después se pondrán los subtítulos en español para la página, para el video en YouTube. Pueden hacer llegar sus preguntas tanto en inglés como en español. Y después de la presentación de la doctora Faul, nosotros we're really happy to have today Dr. Moria Faul with us. She is the head of research at the Public-Private Partnerships Center at University of Geneva. She's been a visiting research fellow at the UN Research Institute for Social Development, and previously she was part of this, let me see if I have this correct, Center for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge.
Correct.
And she will be talking to us about power and partnerships for the Sustainable Development Goals. Moira, thank you very much for joining us. I leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Gabby. So today we are talking about partnerships, power, and the SDGs. And starting off, just let me get the screen right. That's working for everybody, I hope. Yeah, great. Okay, so partnerships, really just to start off with some recent history here. The UN General Assembly in 2015 passed the Sustainable Development Goals, and the partnership was really an important part of that. The reason being that they were saying that fundamentally the lives of all will be profoundly improved, and also the world will be transformed through these public-private partnerships. More recently than that, in Latin America, at the beginning of this month, there was an investigation that was really saying that public-private partnerships have been a huge vector of bribery and corruption, and that this has basically facilitated a huge amount of very problematic behaviors. And also a bit closer to home for me, since I'm from Zimbabwe, the Bridge International Schools public-private partnership in Uganda ran into some trouble because the government, the Minister of Education, said that she was very unhappy with what was happening, both in terms of the provision of education, the quality of education, but also things that, as basic as sanitation and security for students. So partnerships have a great deal to live up to in terms of the promise, what it is that people believe them to be able to do. And also we are seeing some very problematic outcomes from taking on these public-private partnerships. So just very briefly, what is it that we can see if we take a look at research literature, both in terms of the academic literature and also in terms of what NGOs are putting out. So there are 4 different types of narratives of partnerships that we find. First of all, there is this normative or ethical way of looking at partnerships, which basically say, you know what, partnerships, this is an ethically appropriate way of organizing ourselves. If we want to get sustainable development, actually we need to bring the public and private sectors together, and normatively this is a good thing. Then we have this very positive instrumental way of looking at it, which says, you know what, this is fundamentally a way of doing something that is getting things done very efficiently and effectively, and we should like it because it's getting the job done. The third way of looking at it is this very technical approach of monitoring and evaluation, which is basically saying, we set up partnerships in order to get this job done, let's work out how they're doing it. And that's actually somewhat negative, because it's actually saying that the partnerships, we have this huge promise of partnerships, but actually, are they delivering? And as we saw from the examples before, the jury is very much out on that. Then there is this final instrumental argument, which is instrumental and negative in this case, where basically you have people writing that public-private partnerships fundamentally are only there to make sure that the private sector is able to get more profit and use government money to do so. So if these are the four things that people are writing about, then how is it that they're actually being, in terms of power, what's happening? And what we see in terms of power is the first three types of writing discount power completely. And in the last one, this negative instrumental view of private sector profiteering, the narrative of power is simply so overwhelming that there's nothing that can be done about it, and it's just, it's all doom and gloom. So what I'm saying with my work is really to say, well, let's think a little bit more about what's going on, and let's think a bit harder about scratching the surface. So going back to basics and definitions, these are the kinds of things that we find in the policy documents when we're looking at partnership. And this provides a certain context for what it is that's actually happening inside partnerships. So if we look at some of the aid relations, the changing narratives of aid relations, then what it is that we find is actually that in the 1980s and 90s, when we look at documents, it's donorship, but there's a much longer history of that, where fundamentally we have donors giving money and telling recipients how they should be spending it. In 2005, there was a Paris Declaration which talked much more about ownership, where the power relations were really reversed, and rather than donors telling recipients what to do with money, in this document, it was agreed that recipients should be telling donors what it is that they want to do with money, and the donors should align behind those priorities. That declaration was very good on paper. There's not been very much evidence that that was put into practice. And then in 2011 and 2015, we have much more work now being done, or well, many more policy documents anyway, on this idea of partnership, and that these partnerships are absolutely critical to delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the Sustainable Development Goals, partnership is one of the 5 principles underpinning the Sustainable Development Goals, along with people, prosperity, planet, and peace, as well as being a key element of Sustainable Goal 17, which is all about the rules of implementation of the other 16 goals. So it's really seen as being central and very, very important to making sustainable development happen everywhere. So this is the context in which partnerships are operating. We have a long historical context that this Sustainable Development Declaration is 18 months old. There's a huge historical context behind that, which was not saying that partnership was necessarily the way to go, and that must affect what then happens now. So in terms of saying how does this context and the power relationship in this context play out, what I'm going to walk you through today is looking at the elements, who is allowed to be a partner, the relationships among these elements, among the different partners, the whole partnership system as a system in itself, and the functions of these different systems. And so in terms of these elements, originally it was about nation states, and nation states were absolutely what it was all about. Then it was much more bringing in these international organizations, whether they were donors like the World Bank or other non-donor UN agencies. And then with the Partnership Declaration in 2011 and the SDGs, talking about also bringing in civil society and private sector actors. So that's an awful lot of different partners to be holding at the same time. So it's usually broken down into the categories of government, business, NGO, and international governmental organizations. And a lot of people stop there, and they basically say it's about relationships between these different sectors or these different types of actors. But obviously it's much more complex than that. And arguably, if you have an NGO that is a local NGO partnering with a global business, that's going to lead to very different power dynamics than if you were to have maybe a global NGO partnering with a local business. But we can't assume this. We need to look into it in different cases in order to understand it better. So the case that I looked at was a global partnership where they had donor countries recipients, these multilateral or international agencies, civil society and private sector involvement. So this is what the makeup of this particular partnership was on paper. And these donor countries, as you can see, donor countries and recipient countries have more partners involved than the other actors, and so there are many reasons for that. States historically have a privileged position when it comes to these kind of roles of doing development, so to speak. But certainly you can see from that that the proportions are different. But donor countries and recipient countries have equal representation here in terms of the number of people and proportion of people that are at the table, which is very, very different to what it was previously. But again, we need to scratch under the surface, and scratching under the surface means that we can see something like, for example, who is it who is representing donor countries? The representatives of donor countries in many of these partnerships are specialists. They are civil servants, specialists in aid effectiveness. What does aid effectiveness mean? It means basically how much development, so to speak, am I getting for my dollars? And these people are sitting around a table with the representatives of recipient countries, who in most cases are ministers of the government department that the partnership is working with or for. So you would have ministers of education or ministers of health, for example, sitting down to have conversations with very senior civil servants who basically want to have an econometric conversation, and the ministers of education are politicians who may be more or less in control of their brief and who may have other motivations for being there. So again, it changes what's happening inside the partnership if you can understand who is actually involved inside it. Then the next thing that I did with this particular research project was to say, well, let's compare who's involved in the formal network and who actually speaks to each other. So I went and I asked the people who were involved in the formal network, who are you in contact with, and what you thought about when you were in contact with them. And this is what they reported to me. So you can see there are a few more donors involved than in the formal network. There are a few more multilateral civil society, a lot more private sector actors, and quite a few more researchers. But in terms of recipients, there are none. So when I actually asked the people involved, who do you discuss these issues with? Nobody said a recipient, government, which is an important finding in itself. This is not missing data. This is actually saying that these people in this partnership are not prioritizing relationships with the recipient country governments that they are claiming to be in partnership with. So comparing again what it is that people say on paper and what it is they do in practice makes a difference to what we can understand about what's happening in partnership and the powers that we have, the power that is at play inside the partnership system. So if we actually look at, so the organization being these groups of actors, that's what we're looking at with these elements to say who is it who's actually involved. Then we also need to think about the network, which is basically to say what are not only the elements, but also the relations between them. And when I look at relations, I'm looking to see, does a relationship exist? What is the direction of the relationship and the reciprocity? Now, direction and Reciprocity, to give you an example, would be to say, if I say that Gabi is my friend, but she doesn't say that I am her friend, then the likelihood is that she's the popular kid, a lot more popular than I am, because I want to be her friend, but she doesn't necessarily want me to be her friend, or even if she doesn't really mind me one way or the other, I'm not the top of her mind when she's talking about her friendship circle. And that makes a big difference when it comes to actually looking at prestige and relations of power inside of these networks. And then also with the relations, we look at things like strength and structure. So that's thinking about then the relations inside the system, the relations between the different elements. And here, lots and lots of numbers in boxes. Okay, so basically this is what's called an adjacency matrix. And the one on the left there that you can see with lots of ones and zeros is the formal network. And basically the formal network on paper says, in this network, everybody is equally related to everybody else. So if you can think of your friendship network, then basically that means that if you asked one person in that friendship network who their friends were, they would say exactly the same names as everybody else in that friendship network. Now, I can tell that you already worked out that this is a highly unlikely set of events. But actually, this is what formally on paper people are saying partnerships should look like. Everyone should be equally connected into the network. Now, there are zeros on the research and politician side of it, because in the formal network, these people do not actually exist. They don't come up in the formal network on paper to say these are important members of the network. But they did come up in interview, so therefore I put them in terms of the informal network. Now, the second set of numbers there is the informal network, and you can see just by looking at it that it is very, very different to the formal network. And that the fact that it is different in these ways means that we can then again look under the surface and say, well, in what ways is it different? And if you look here, for example, so the donor-to-donor relationships, every donor who says, I have a donor who's a friend, the donors will say that donor is also my friend. But if we go down here, for example, we can see that multilateral actors are 3 times as likely to claim a donor as a contact than a donor is to claim a multilateral, and that's a donor state. Equally, civil society are much, much, much more likely to claim relationships with donors than donors are to necessarily think that civil society are important enough to claim a relationship with. So anything that's over 1 shows you that these groups are claiming more of a relationship with these groups. Anything that is under 1 shows you that these groups are claiming less of a relationship with these groups. And as you can see, the recipients both are 0 in both ways, because as I said before, none of them were considered important enough to be counted as an important interlocutor by the people interviewed. And then that's just a graphic representation, so you can see that here donors are this much overrepresented. If we take this as the baseline, that this is where everyone should be represented, recipients are underrepresented, etc., etc. Okay, this, for those people who care about these things, is basically saying that not only are these things different, because you can see up here that they are very different, this is basically saying not only are they different, they are also significant. Statistically significantly different. And this procedure basically says they are significantly different. So these relationships then are looking at this idea of instituting these networked structures. And the important thing about them is that they are seen to define, enable, or constrain the behaviors of partners inside them. and the structures actually make a difference in these partnership systems. So, as I said before, on paper, these formal networks are supposed to be equally, everybody is equally structured into the network. Everyone has equal access to everybody else. However, the informal network is different in this way. And you can see there, you've got a core periphery structure. The core is very much made up of the donor states and the multilateral or international organizations. And the biggest ones of these are actually multilateral donor organizations. The smaller ones and the ones that are further out are the multilateral organizations that don't actually give money but may have programs in these areas. So the non-sort of funding organizations. And there you can see that they're very, very different. And it's not only that they're visually very different, as we saw before from the significance test, that they are significantly different. Okay, then another aspect of systems thinking says we need to look at the functions that these networks and sub-networks form. And if we look at this network in more detail, then I invite you to take a look at the researchers. These are the green nodes here. And you can see that rather than being in a cluster like the donors are, or in a similar place like some of the civil society actors are, the researchers are really dotted around this network map in lots of different locations. One reading of this would be to say that, well, rather than evidence-based policy, what we are seeing in this particular network map and the function this particular network map serves is to show us that actually the researchers are being used, and each policy maker has their own preferred researcher who happens to agree with what it is that they are saying. That is one way of looking at it. I use a systems approach and complexity theory, so I'm obviously going to say that it's much more complex than that. But it's important to be able to say, if we really dive into this network, we can understand the function that the different subsystems inside the network, inside the partnership serve, and actually how these different functions will support, more or less, the different outcomes that will come out of this partnership as system outcomes. So one example in terms of looking at the outcomes, yesterday was World Mother Tongue Language Day. And if it hadn't been for this particular actor, it is highly unlikely, and what the work that he did in the early 2000s, it is highly unlikely that mother tongue language acquisition would have been put quite so center stage in terms of education policy, both globally and then therefore nationally. And in the 1990s, mother tongue language acquisition and language teaching was very much seen as, and also dismissed as, an NGO agenda that had no place in serious policy discussions. And because of this particular individual being in this network and holding the particular place that he did in this network and being related into this particular partnership in this specific way, that was a very important reason why mother tongue language teaching became an important education policy priority. Now, that individual, if he had not been in this particular partnership and connected into this particular partnership in this particular way, he would not have been able to have the influence he did, and therefore have that as an outcome. Equally, if these other actors had not also been able to be convinced by it, then that outcome would not have happened. So I'm not saying it's one person and that particular individual hero made everything happen. It's all about these complex effects of the elements, how the elements are related to each other, how the system as a whole is functioning, and the function that the different aspects of the system play, and how actually they may or may not be insulated from their context or affected by their context. And so this really is a sort of a quick summary of how we could think about using systems approaches and marrying it with a keen eye for power when we're looking at public-private partnerships or these cross-sectoral partnerships, because these contexts, as we saw before, we're talking about centuries of very unequal power relations. They provide a context of existing asymmetries of power, and those existing asymmetries of power affect which elements are considered to be valid. So up until very recently, the only actors that were seen to have an important say in development policy and practice were national governments. And this has very much changed. And the partnership paradigm, if that's what we want to call it, has changed that even further. Then the systems approach tells us you've got to look at the relations among these different elements. There's no point in just listing out who's involved and who isn't involved. You also have to look at how they are related to each other, both on paper and also in practice. And then we can consider the system as a whole and look in detail at specific areas of the network map inside this partnership system to understand what the functions of this subsystems are, and also the system as a whole. And that will give us some better idea of what's actually going on in terms of the partnership, and also the way power works inside the partnership and how it affects the system outcomes and the impacts of those system outcomes. So in terms of the actual partnerships side of things, again, going back to some academic theory, basically there's an awful lot of theory that says that partnerships in these networks, there's absolutely no place for any discussion of power because these networks are reducing power, they're reflecting power. But actually network theory tells us that actually networks can reinforce power and deepen inequalities. And looking at these different partnerships and actually going in depth into these investigations of what's happening inside these partnerships allows us to see which of these three theories is actually happening in the different partnerships that we look at. I'm not assuming at all that any one of those three things is the right thing. What I'm saying is we need to look, we can't assume that any one of those three things is correct. We need to look into the different partnerships and see what is happening. And so by looking at these organizations, not only as groups of actors, but also making sure we look at the relations between them, we can actually do something really useful in terms of working out what's going on and what could then be done about it. So what could be done about it? Well, in terms of context, something that's really important is a concept of insulation. To what extent can a partnership insulate itself from external power relations? To what extent can any organization insulate itself from external power relations? And one of the ways that this insulation can be done is by agenda setting. So for example, a lot of work that feminists did in the 1980s and 90s in developing countries was done also using alliances in the North, where they were actually able to say, look, here is a global agenda that we need to be part of. And so they're agenda setting in their own country by making these alliances globally. So that's one example where feminists managed to really insulate themselves to a certain extent from local and national power relations there. In terms of the elements, who gets to decide who is a partner and who is not a partner, and on what basis? And one of the ways that this can be overcome is by having participatory processes where you are trying to include as many people, as many different groups and interest groups as possible in deciding who gets to be a partner. This goes beyond stakeholder management. into real participatory processes. But then once you've done that, you need to facilitate many partners' inclusion, because people will be able to say, well, I'm formally at the table, but if I don't have the same amount of time or money to dedicate to preparing for these partnership meetings or to the partnership at all as somebody else, then I could be formally at the table but not actually able to participate. And that is something that is very much being seen in a great number of these partnerships, particularly at the board level. So that's one thing to do for the elements. And then in terms of the relationships, well, there's an awful lot of people who work on aid relations who say that the important thing for aid relations is actually developing countries need to demand more forcefully what it is that they want. This research using a network approach is actually saying the thing that's more important, or certainly something that needs to be done alongside, is that more powerful actors in this network, in these partnerships, need to rewire their relationships. What does that mean? It means that they need to look very carefully at the quantity and quality of the interactions that they're having with the less powerful, less central members of the partnership, and make sure that they are making a positive effort to relate more to those partners that they wouldn't necessarily do so automatically. So that's as far as the relations are concerned. And by doing those three things, then you really are improving the likelihood that the partnership system as a whole can really bring about these transformative outcomes that the SDGs is saying that it should. And also you're improving the functioning of the partnership and the sub-elements of the partnership, the subsystems inside the partnership, to really be making that difference that is desired. So in terms of system approach, just to very quickly wrap up, is it too much to call it a myth in a lot of development thinking and practice that says that there's this linear approach where if we think about the right inputs and the right activities and the right outputs, then we'll simply get the right outcomes and impacts? And what a systems approach is actually saying is that kind of linear approach and the technical, rational approach is simply not appropriate or useful in a large number of development interventions. And actually, what we need to be thinking about is these feedbacks from what is actually going on inside the partnership system in this particular case, and the context. And then once we have one kind of outcome of the partnership, how does that then feed back into this partnership system and make those differences? And really sort of doing a sort of contrast between what we could call conventional development thinking and systems thinking. Is, if conventional thinking is talking about static things and events, then systems thinking is really saying, hang on a minute, let's look at the dynamic here over time. And then, conventional thinking is talking about, a lot of externally driven change, whereas systems thinking is saying, well, actually it's an outcome of a system. It's not simply about saying it's something that's coming from the outside. Conventional thinking is detail-oriented, whereas systems thinking is saying you've got to take the context into account. You've got to think about the relationships. Conventional thinking, certainly research, is looking at, what are these different factors that are involved and how do they correlate amongst themselves, and how does that tell us something? Systems thinking is saying let's actually look at what's happening inside these systems and uncover the causality inside there. And conventional thinking is very much, as I said, about linear causality, whereas systems thinking is saying we've got feedback loops here all the time. We have emergent outcomes. It's not enough to say that A plus B equals C, that A follows B and therefore C will happen next. That's simply not how people work. It's not how social development works. And then if you want to talk about how social development impacts on environments, and if we're then talking about eco-social development and also economic matters, then it simply can't be assumed to follow linear cause and effect. That has been shown to be the case in over and over again. So in terms of partnerships power in the SDGs, I take a systems approach to understanding this. I take the question of power very seriously within that. And it's really important to make sure that we go beyond the rhetoric and we go under the surface to actually look at what is happening. Partnerships hold a great deal of promise to both fulfill the SDGs and to fulfill all kinds of personal and also national goals and international and global goals too. But we can't assume that that's happening, but nor can we assume that we should just write these things off completely. They are places where change is happening, and therefore systems approaches will tell us we need to go to these places where change is happening, see what is happening and how, and what it is that could actually be done within those spaces of change to make things work out better. And if anybody is interested in more detail on that, I've got 2 papers from last year where I go into this in more detail, and you've got the links there on the screen for you. Okay, Gabby?
Thank you very much, Moira. I'm going to, I tried to group the questions in topics, but
Yep.
I mean, you can feel free to answer them as you think it suits you best. The first 2 actually are very much from the civil society perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, first, how they can actually be involved in partnerships, considering like especially local civil societies. You talk a bit more about the end on the participatory process, and maybe that's something you could say a little bit more. And one question was how, like, if they really have local NGOs, if they really have an option, since they are never the popular guys, and how they can make their way into partnership or effective partnerships, and not just by name.
Sure. Okay, so there's 2, I think there are 3 different things going on there, so I'll take them separately. The first thing is, and I'm just going to write them down so I don't forget them. So the first thing is getting in. Then there's a question around the design of the partnerships, and then there's also a question about practices inside partnerships. So for civil society, I think it's really important to remember what power you do have and what cards you do have that you can play. And the fact that these partnership documents and the fact that these global agreements are saying partnerships are absolutely critical means that there's a space there where civil society organizations can ask for a seat at the table, citing these policy documents. Now, those are the global documents. You also need to know what your local and national documents and processes are. So that's very important. Now, there are all kinds of different public-private partnerships. There are public-private partnerships that are literally a contract between a government who is paying for a service from a private supplier. And if that is the case, then there isn't necessarily a role for a civil society organization to be inside the partnership. Depending on the civil society organization and what your goal is and and how it is that you're set up, what your mission is, it may well be that monitoring the implementation of that partnership and the extent to which it's actually delivering on the social or environmental goals that it is supposed to be that government money is being used for, that could be a way of, if not participating in the partnership, certainly participating in making sure that the partnership is actually delivering on what it's supposed to be delivering on. So that's the first question about getting in, I suppose. If there is a specific, if there's a specific partnership that you are interested in getting into, then it's about understanding what the rules of engagement are for that particular partnership, and working out who it is that you need to speak to in order to be able to get into that partnership. But always, always, always making sure that it is aligned with your organization's mission, your organization's goal, and also the normative ground that you stand on. So if your members and the people that you represent in your NGO would expect you to be part of that partnership, and they would see that as being a useful thing for you to do, then that makes sense. If your membership and where you draw your platform from would find that an option to do, then obviously you need to be engaging with those members and making the case for this as well. So that's getting in. Then in terms of designing partnerships, if basically something has been said that there will be a public-private partnership on X, and we are looking for civil society members, then it's really important to make sure that the design of these partnerships is egalitarian, that it is very much saying this is about participation, it is about inclusion, and that not only the structures are saying that, but also the processes. One of the big downfalls in public-private partnerships, I think, is that they are designed on paper to be inclusive and participatory, but what happens then in practice doesn't follow that through, because the processes and the procedures are not attended to with the same level of detail as the charter document. So the charter document basically says, we are inclusive, we are participatory, we are wonderful, but it doesn't go into the detail about actually saying, and this is how we are participatory, and this is how we ensure inclusion, and this is how we are making sure that we report back to our target populations. So there is a great deal that needs to be done in terms of turning partnership agreements and charters into inclusive practices. And that brings me to the last point, which is the practices. So once you're involved in these partnerships, it's also really important to be tracking the extent to which you feel that the charter is being lived up to, and being able to make sure that you are actively logging incidents where you feel that the partnership has not lived up to its promise of inclusion, for example, or where you feel, if you find out that there's been a closed door discussion that you've not been part of, then that needs to be logged and needs to be dealt with. And at the same time, being very realistic about the fact that, you know, getting a seat on the table requires different tactics than actually having a seat at the table and making things happen at that table. Getting a seat at the table might require campaigns, and it might require some, what's the word? Some more assertive tactics in terms of the demands that you are putting in. But once you get to the table, then it's not to say that you roll over and play dead, but you do need to be going in with a more conversational, negotiating stance, and that takes into account what your bottom line is and that you won't shift from. But you know, you can't, in this, so an example might be in the 1960s and the 1970s, feminists were fighting a political battle to get, and more recently in many countries, They're fighting a political battle to get the vote, to get equal rights, to get equal recognition. There are an awful lot of women in an awful lot of countries where those rights are there on paper, but actually inside their own homes, they are fighting a battle for equality. You're not going to take the same tactics as you would chaining yourself to the railings of a government building in your own home. You will take a much gentler negotiating approach. I hope that answers the questions.
Yes, and I think the next set of questions actually builds up on this kind of crash between partnerships in paper and the reality when they are translated into action. Mm-hmm. One of the questions is if recipients are not prioritized in reality, but they are very much at the focus mm-hmm. on the partnerships on paper, how they can have a stronger kind of presence at the table. Mm-hmm. And the second one was also related to this crash, and was how does the researchers, and this is from the researchers part, how they can make sure that they're not only used, mm-hmm. are actually working together. Mm-hmm. Because I believe it's also the expectation of researchers when coming into a partnership is to collaborate and not just be a means to policy or.
Okay. So as far as the recipients are concerned, I would say one thing would be to commission this kind of research where it's actually then you have something where you can put up a pretty picture with different colored spots on a wall and say, actually, this is how it is right now. And that's not what we said we wanted when we started out. So what are we going to do to change that? So that's one way where you can actually show the other partners that this is not what we agreed. This is not what we said we would do. So how can we work towards changing that? Another one is to, and this is being done in one global partnership that I can think of, but it's taken 6 years since this was first proposed to actually, now it's going through the board for approval. So time is a really important thing here. One of the things that's happening is that basically people have said we need to programs in country. We need to set some money aside in order to fund the recipient country partners to participate more effectively, because they don't have the time to dedicate to preparing for the meetings. They don't have the time to dedicate to consulting with the other constituency members that they maybe are supposed to be representing. They don't have any staff working on this, whereas the donor countries may have a team of sort of 40 to 100 people working on this one particular issue. So it's there's money is also something that is important, but it needs to go with a plan that shows how it is that the money is going to be spent in order to improve that participation. And really importantly, don't accept a design solution. To say we will change the charter, we will change the architecture, we will change the structure of the partnership on paper is not going to make the problem go away. That's very, very, very important. But also don't accept a technical solution. Partnerships are not technical problems, and I think this is an absolutely critical piece that cannot be stated often enough. They are not technical solutions, and they are not solving technical problems. Social development environmental development, economic development, none of these things are technical problems. They are profoundly human and social problems, and therefore they cannot be solved only with technical solutions, which is why I take a systems approach, because it's always the technical plus the human plus the social plus the environmental, complexity on complexity on complexity. So that's the recipients at the table. Then in terms of the researchers, so that's a tricky one, because researchers tend not to be formally part of partnerships unless they are research partnerships, where it's researchers working together. And you don't, once you've done your research and it's gone out into the world, you don't have control over how it's used necessarily. If you feel it's being misused, you can always speak up and say, that's not what my research says. And there have been many cases where that is happening. I think in the world of education right now, there's a very contentious issue happening around the Bridges International group, where one set of researchers has been contracted by the government of Liberia to do randomized control trials on the Bridge International schools, with a control of schools that are not part of that particular program. And this has already been criticized. It was being criticized before it was even set up. And one of the reasons for the criticism is actually to say, to what extent can you actually have a randomized control trial in an educational setting? It's not, you know, it's not a medical trial. It's different. It's much more complex. And then, you know, how do you control the controls? If, you know, the Bridges International schools are saying, you know, our class sizes will be no bigger than 45, which already sounds big to a lot of people, but, you know, they're saying there will be no more than 45 children in any class. If they're taking over a school where the average class size is 60, where do those extra 15 children go? They're going to go to the public schools that don't have the right to say we're not accepting pupils. And therefore the control is no longer a control. So that's deeply problematic. The response to that from a particular group of NGOs has been to put out a call for qualitative research. However, in the call, they have basically said that they are looking for qualitative research to be undertaken that proves that they're doing the wrong thing. So you've got, on one side, this very sort of technical, scientific way of saying, we're going to do a randomized control trial and we will see what happens. But it's, I would argue, inappropriate to the context, to the case, to the basis of what an RCT can do. But on the other side, you have, you know, another group coming in and saying, we're going to undertake research that proves that we're right and you're wrong. So it's, yeah, it's not, that's one example of just how complex these things can be. But equally, you then have, on top of that, you have the government saying, we are undertaking this RCT, and this RCT will tell us what policy we should fund and what policy direction we should fulfill. Now, a couple of years ago, when the climate change is still debated, but a lot less than it was a few years ago. I don't know if you remember there was sort of climate scientists whose emails were hacked, and there was, you know, sort of talk about a conspiracy and all of these things. And I think one of the things that we as researchers need to be very careful about is actually to state the limits of what research can do and cannot do for policy. We are not, if we allow political decisions to be made into research and evidence decisions, we are doing ourselves and the wider world a disservice, because there are political decisions that need to be taken, and the political decisions are who gets more and who gets less. How do we distribute the resources in such a way that those who have less now might have more in the future? And these are political decisions. They are not evidence decisions. Evidence can come in and say, if you want to do redistribution, then actually in these particular cases for these particular types of people, then cash transfers are the best way to do it. Or for these groups and these particular types of people, then you need to have tax credits. Or for these, but the political decision is still how, whether you're going to do it or not. And when you're talking about, sort of low-cost private schooling, or you're talking about private education versus public education, these are not just evidence-based decisions, they are political decisions. And therefore, if we allow ourselves to become the arbiters of political decisions, we will end up having much, much, much more difficult time. We need, in the same way as when we do our research and we say there are limitations to the study, and we are adding something to something that is much, much, much bigger than our work, we need to have the same humility and realism when it comes to advising on policy.
Thank you, Moria. And I think this is the last time to close on time and to close on a more lighter note.
Yes.
We have a lot of examples on the partnerships that don't work and partnerships that have gone wrong. And someone is asking if you can think of a partnership that is an example of good practice. Sure. I guess it doesn't necessarily mean that it has worked perfectly, just that they can use as an example of how a partnership can be done right.
Yep, absolutely. So one of the things that we have to bear in mind when we're talking about partnerships is that these are very, very, very recent things. And so when we say, has a partnership worked, who knows? What we can say is that there are partnerships who are currently doing things that maybe work a bit better for certain people and work a bit less well for others. What we can say is that there are certain partnerships that are set up with the intention of doing certain things and that don't necessarily go all the way. But I don't want to condemn all partnerships outright, nor do I want to say that all partnerships are wonderful. But equally, all partnerships are work in progress. And one of the things that I find most helpful when looking at partnerships is, rather than using the noun, use the verb and talk about partnering and talk about the way that we can trace partnering behaviors that are more or less conducive to achieving the goal of the partnership. And I think if we see it as all human endeavor, as a process of becoming, as a process of partnering, then we can maintain our optimism. And I'm very, very keen on maintaining my optimism in all of these things.
Good, that sounds more optimistic. Moria, thank you very much for joining us. It has been our pleasure to have you with us. We will probably still receive a couple of questions from people watching the webinar in a different time zone. If you are one of those people, please feel free to send your questions. I will make sure that Moria gets them. Or you can contact Moria directly via Twitter. Thank you very much. We will see you next week. Thank you, Moria. Bye.
Thank you very much for hosting me. Bye.